In opposition to Hegel, who views the dialectic movement as the process in which the idea of the absolute seeks to objectify, know, and realize itself in the idea of freedom, and in which thesis and antithesis come into a contradiction that leads to a synthesis as a way to produce the teleological development of human history and human thought, culture, philosophy. In his contribution to the critique of political economy, Marx defines the dialectical movement as the process that leads from the abstract to the concrete. And in his 11 theses on Feuerbach, which he wrote in the spring of 1845 and which were published in Engels' book Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, Marx defines reality as practice and proposes a method of critical practice in which the forms of self-alienation, which are equivalent to the denial of human dignity and freedom, that are expressed in religion, that are expressed in politics, and above all in economy. Developing this method, which he proposes in his critique of Ludwig Feuerbach and his materialism, which in turn is a critique to Hegelian absolute idealism, throughout his works like the German ideology, the Sacred Family, the Communist Manifesto, and especially the 3 volumes of Capital, his contribution to the critique of political economy, amongst many other works, Marx develops historical materialism, and from the category of the anarchy of production, which implies that because the means of production and development of the forces of production, together with the application of science and technology, are completely and utterly centralized, that is controlled by the dominant class, by the bourgeoisie, the commodities in both material and intellectual work which are produced in capitalism, both in traditional industries and in what Theodor Adorno from the first generation of the School of Frankfurt called the industry of culture, are produced not to satisfy the needs of the majorities, not to satisfy the needs that are required to perpetuate the life of individuals and of communities. That is why millions of people in the third world die of starvation, whilst in the first world they have crises of superproduction of unnecessary commodities which respond to needs that drift away from what needs are truly required to perpetuate life. And because the means of production and the development of the forces of production, together with the use of science and technology, respond not to the needs of the majorities, but to the interests of the capitalists, science and technology are employed to the war industry, to an industry in which medicines are fabricated and produced, not to heal but to sell, an industry which relies on energies which are not renewable and which are destroying the planet, and in general using the enormous technological capacity of capitalism, which Herbert Marcuse in his essay on liberation claims that are more than enough to resolve the problems of poverty and starvation, are thus employed to maximize profit. And profit in capitalism, as Marx defines in his first volume of Capital, is the result of the accumulation of commodities and of surplus value. Surplus value implies that the totality of value, that is human life objectified in the process of production of both material and intellectual work, when it is measured in money and it thus becomes the price of a commodity when that commodity is commercialized in the market, is not completely returned in the salary of the proletariat in both material and intellectual work. The totality of the value of the commodity produced, which is human life objectified, is not completely returned in the salary, and the majority of that value, which is human life objectified in both material and intellectual work, is accumulated in the form of private property by the bourgeoisie when the commodity is commercialized. There is absolute and relative surplus value, and together with the category of the anarchy of production, which allows us to understand alienated work, alienated because the purpose of the mode of production is to satisfy the needs of the majority of the individuals and the communities and societies they form. But in capitalism, due to the fact that the means of production are completely controlled and increasingly centralized by the bourgeoisie, by the dominant class, the means of production, the forces of production, science and technology do not respond to the needs of the majority, but to the interests of the dominant class. It also allows us to understand the crisis of superproduction, which is a crisis generated by the irrational production of unnecessary commodities that cause all kinds of environmental issues and which also exploit the third world in the neo-colonial exploitation in the world market, which is something very important because it implies a development in Marxist theory of value that explains the way in which, through the global market, through neo-colonial exploitation, the technologically more developed capitals of the center, that is of the first world, extract surplus value, which is called extraordinary profit, from the technologically less developed capitals of the periphery or of the third world. And this process of exploitation has been taking place for 500 years because in the Middle Ages, the Latin Germanic Europe, that is to say the Europe of the Western Roman Empire, which had a mode of production that was feudal and which had a system of political organization, opened itself in 1492 to the Atlantic and broke the siege of the Ottoman and Arab Empire. And by opening itself in 1492 to the Atlantic Ocean, it began the first cycle of world accumulation of capital, which allowed the necessary resources in order to cause the contradiction between the social relations of production in feudalism and the development of the forces of production that allowed to go from the cultivation of land to manufacture, and from the 18th century onward to the industrial mode of production through the Industrial Revolution. So the social relations of production in feudal society came into a contradiction with the massive development of the forces of production that was made possible through the imposition of colonialism in America and Africa, the use of slaves in order to extract resources from America allowed the forces of production to develop to such a degree that they became incompatible with the social relations of production in feudalism. That's why capitalism emerged. And from the 16th century, in which colonialism was used to accumulate value in Europe, all the way to the present day, in which the technologically more developed capitals extract extraordinary profit or a form of surplus value in the world market from the less developed capitals of the third world, also explains why first world countries like North America and even some countries in Europe, with England under the administration of Margaret Thatcher, were involved directly in funding and aiding various dictatorships in Latin America, from the dictatorship of Pinochet in Chile to the dictatorship of Videla in Argentina, and in many other countries like in Colombia, where we suffer a terrible armed conflict in which the state is responsible for many massacres and genocides, and despite all the crimes the state has committed, internationally it is recognized as a democracy because that Colombian state sells all the resources that are produced in Colombia in the world market, exposing the country to the neo-colonial capitalist exploitation of the world market. So taking into account the anarchy of production, the alienation of work, which takes place also in intellectual work, because scientists in today's industries are not able to transform, to creatively contribute to the industries they work for. They have to apply their knowledge without any kind of innovation to what the industry requires, and are thus suffering from alienated work, because what they produce, their work, does not belong to them. It belongs to the capitalist of the particular market or industry in which they are objectifying their scientific research and knowledge into technology. That is why we have programmed obsolescence, in which technological devices are produced deliberately to fail in less time than they should and could last, in order purely to create cycles of irrational and destructive consumption, taking into account also the validity of categories like surplus value, absolute and relative, especially in third world countries and in the first world. Even if the salary is substantially greater than the means of subsistence, the fact that the totality of the value, which is human life objectified in both material and intellectual work, is not fully returned in the salary, is still completely valid in the first world. Taking into account how historical materialism seeks to understand culture, politics, law, and all the other characteristics of a society, which are traditionally called the superstructure, in terms of the contradictions between the social relations of production to the means of production and the development of the forces of production, contradictions that express themselves in the exploitation of surplus value, in alienated work, in the crisis of superproduction, and in the destructive use and application of science and technology. Arguing in favor of the validity of historical materialism, I will show in this video that Jordan Peterson knows absolutely nothing about historical materialism or postmodernism, because on the other side of the spectrum, on the other side of the philosophical discussion, ever since Lyotard published his first book, The Postmodern Condition, in that book Lyotard defines the postmodern movement as a reaction against the so-called meta-narratives which are in crises. He thinks that Hegelian absolute idealism and Marxism are both part of those meta-narratives, together with the enlightened project of modernity. Now, postmodernists, in the light of what Lyotard wrote in his book, The Postmodern Condition, rebel against these so-called meta-narratives. So when Jordan Peterson speaks of postmodern Marxists, it makes absolutely no sense. It is as irrational and as meaningless as to say an evolutionary creationist. You cannot say that there is an evolutionary creationist, because creationism and evolution are mutually opposed. And in the case of Marxism and postmodernism, postmodernists and Marxists often tend to be as divided and as in discussion and in opposition as an evolutionary biologist would be with a creationist. A Marxist views society in terms of the contradictions between capital and wage labor, between class struggle, that is to say the domination of the bourgeoisie over the proletariat, of the destructive application of the means of production, of the exploitation in the world market, of imperialism as the last stage of capitalism, whilst a postmodernist like Foucault, Deleuze, tries to view the contradictions of modernity in terms of what Foucault called the archaeology of epistemology, and trying to diagnose the forms of oppression and control present in biopower, present in the societies of control, which Deleuze describes. And these forms of analysis from Foucault's archaeology of epistemology, which shows that there is a will of control and domination behind the will to know of science, and shows how science has been used in modernity in the institutions of control to impose a power over sexuality, identity, psychology even, which is called biopower. Deleuze shows the contradictions of the societies of control, although Deleuze might be a little closer to a critique of capitalism, at least in the traditional Marxist sense. But in general, postmodernists are extremely opposed to the methods of historical materialism, so much as would be expected from a creationist opposed to an evolutionary biologist. So when Jordan Peterson speaks of postmodern Marxists, he makes absolutely no sense. Now, the critique Jordan Peterson makes, he makes of the Communist Manifesto is absolutely superficial, because in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels propose that the history of societies is the history of class struggle. They propose the category of crises of superproduction. They speak about absolute and relative surplus value. They speak about the need to abolish private property, and they do not mean to arbitrarily cause that all of our personal possessions go into collective possession, or the possession of society, but what they mean with the abolition of private property is that the illegitimately accumulated value, which is not returned in the salary of the worker who produces the value of a commodity and which is accumulated by the bourgeoisie in the form of private property, that private property is what must be abolished. And by abolishing that private property, surplus value would be abolished so that the totality of the value, which is human life objectified, in a commodity is fully returned in the salary of the worker in all areas of industry, be it scientific research, be it education, be it health, or being the traditional proletariat in a factory. So in order to do a truly rigorous and academic critique of the Communist Manifesto, Jordan Peterson would have to show that surplus value, absolute and relative, that alienated work, that the anarchy of production, that the destructive use of science and technology are no longer valid. That is to say that they no longer take place in modern day capitalism, but climate change, the exploitation of the third world, the difference between the value of a commodity and the salary of the proletariat, even in the first world, all of these things are empirically demonstrable. That is to say that you can go into the concrete reality of human society, as Marx would say, and you can find the validity of absolute and relative surplus value, of alienated work, of crises of superproduction, together with all the forms of political oppression, from Foucault's biopower to the societies of control which Deleuze describes, all the way to the articulation of psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, and historical materialism, which Herbert Marcuse from the first generation of the School of Frankfurt proposes in his book Eros and Civilization. In that book, Herbert Marcuse shows that there is a basic repression which has to do with the situation of the primitive horde, as Freud called it, in which the Oedipus complex is born and which is characteristic of the species as a whole. And there is also an additional form of repression that responds to the mode of production which conditions the institution of domination and political control in a society in a given stage of the development of the forces of production, so that capitalism has a different form of psychoanalytic repression, of the repression of the impulses which Freud describes, and it is different to the type of repression that you would find in, say, the feudal mode of production. So, bearing in mind the validity of the categories of historical materialism and the validity of the political diagnosis of control of the institutions of domination in Foucault and Deleuze, one can see that postmodernists like Foucault and Deleuze are valid, and that the categories of historical materialism are also valid now more than ever, because the accumulation of weapons of mass destruction, the destruction of the environment, the exploitation of the third world, the risk of another crisis of superproduction that requires the war industry to create conflicts in order to overcome the economic damages, the destructive use of technology that might lead to the dystopian novel of Aldous Huxley, in which science is used to create a new form of totalitarian control and domination. Now more than ever, it is important to return to Marx and to read him very carefully, and not to speak nonsense like Jordan Peterson does. Jordan Peterson clearly hasn't read Marx, and he decides to criticize the Communist Manifesto, which is very rigorous, but which was still written for proletariats as a political pamphlet of action. But he never speaks of Capital, the 3 volumes of Capital, which have thousands of pages. He never speaks of the German ideology. He never speaks of the contribution to the critique of political economy. He never speaks of specific Marxist categories like surplus value, alienated work, anarchy of production. He never speaks of the destructive use of science and technology, which can be understood and has been understood through historical materialism. He never speaks of the development of historical materialism that the School of Frankfurt gave from the addition of psychoanalysis to the framework of historical materialism, thanks to Herbert Marcuse, to the analysis of the industry of culture which Theodor Adorno makes, to all the contributions of Walter Benjamin, Horkheimer, and many others. So Jordan Peterson needs to read Marx. He needs to begin by reading the 11 Theses on Feuerbach. He needs to begin by reading the contribution to the critique of Hegelian philosophy of law or right. He needs to begin by reading the German ideology, the sacred family, the Jewish question, moving on to the Communist Manifesto and seeing that the crisis of superproduction, that the class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat is today causing waves of violence, not only in the third world, but also in the first world. He needs to see the validity of absolute and relative surplus value, and then he can move on to texts like Contribution to the Critique of Classical Political Economy, and of course to the 3 volumes of Capital, which he clearly hasn't read. And once he has done his homework, once he has read Marx, maybe then he can make a critique that is worth listening to. But until then, he has to understand the difference between postmodernists and Marxists, and he needs to read as well the postmodernists, because he clearly hasn't read Lyotard. He doesn't even understand what postmodernism is. Neither does he understand what true Marxism is. And he makes that by taking the historical failure of the Soviet Union or of Mao's Cultural Revolution, that is enough to show the uselessness of the categories of historical materialism. But if you look closely, in the Soviet Union, the means of production were never collectivized. That means that the anarchy of production or alienated work was never overcome. The Bolsheviks became a badly masked bourgeoisie dominant class that had absolute control of the means of production. The proletariat under Stalin's regime, and in general in the history of the Soviet Union, never had control of the means of production. That is why absolute and relative surplus value were not overcome, so that in the Soviet Union the totality of the value of a commodity produced was not fully returned in the salary. And what is more, science as a form of intellectual work not only suffered of alienated work, of the anarchy of production, in which science and technology are not used to satisfy the needs of the majorities. That is why so many peasants perished out of hunger in the Soviet Union, because science and technology were used to fuel military development. The Soviet Union degenerated into a fascist imperialism that has nothing to do with communism. And now, in the case of Mao's Cultural Revolution, it developed into a form of fascist totalitarianism that has many nihilistic religious elements, which are completely opposed to what communism proposes. So that argument is completely invalid, because he can say that in the Soviet Union and in Mao's China, we can see the failure of badly called real socialism. But in fact, in no country of the so-called real socialism were the true reivindications and objectives of communism carried out. Not even in none of these badly called socialist countries, alienated work, anarchy of production, relative and absolute surplus value, and the destructive use of science and technology were overcome. In none of these socialist countries the class struggle were overcome, and the state continued to be a means of violent repression and oppression. So if Jordan Peterson really wants to show that historical materialism is wrong, he needs to show that surplus value, alienated work, crisis of superproduction, the relationship between political domination and oppression, and the contradictions of the economy, and above all, he needs to show that capitalism is today not destroying the planet and not threatening the existence of almost every life form on the surface of the planet. That is the only way to show that historical materialism is not valid. And until then, he needs to read Marx very carefully and distinguish between postmodernist thinkers and Marxist thinkers.